What could make a country that spent weeks vowing never to back down suddenly reach out and ask its enemy to stop? Something changed in a single moment, and tonight we are going to break down exactly what it was. Before we go any further, hit that like button right now, because it genuinely helps this channel grow. Subscribe if you want the full story, and if you know someone who has been following this conflict, send this to them, because what you are about to hear is not the version most channels are telling you. Let's start from the beginning, because the last few weeks have moved so fast that a lot of people missed how this actually started. In late February this year, the United States launched a major military operation against Iran. It was named Operation Epic Fury. The stated goal was simple on paper, but massive in practice: stop Iran's ability to build long-range missiles, cripple its air defenses, and remove any near-term path to a nuclear weapon. What followed was not a short symbolic strike. It was weeks of continuous bombing, night after night, across dozens of locations inside Iranian territory. For the first days, the world watched cautiously. Strikes hit missile storage sites, then command centers, then air defense systems. Iran responded with its own barrage, firing missiles and drones toward American ships and bases in the region, including repeated attacks aimed at a single aircraft carrier operating in the Gulf. Both sides described the exchanges in dramatic terms, but underneath the noise, one side was clearly losing ground faster than the other. Iran also spent those early weeks making its position to the wider region very clear. Officials warned Gulf countries hosting American bases and aircraft that helping Washington would come at a cost. That kind of warning matters, because it shows a government trying to project strength outward even while its own military situation at home was quietly getting worse by the day. Threats aimed outward and weakness building inward are not contradictions. They often happen at exactly the same time, and this conflict became a clear example of that pattern. Israel played a role in setting up this moment too, though it rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as the American campaign. In the months before Operation Epic Fury began, Israeli strikes had already damaged a significant part of Iran's air defense network during an earlier, shorter round of fighting. That earlier damage meant American forces were not starting from zero when this operation launched. A portion of the hardest, most dangerous work of clearing Iranian skies had already been done before the first American bomb ever fell. Understanding that sequence matters because it means the B-52 story we are about to walk through was not happening in some completely untouched battle space. It was happening in an environment that had already been weakened once before the main campaign even started. By early April, more than 5 weeks into the fighting, something shifted. President Trump announced that Iran had, in his words, just asked the United States for a ceasefire. He posted about it publicly, describing Iran's leadership as far more reasonable than what came before, while also warning that strikes would continue in full force until the Strait of Hormuz was fully open again. That single post set off a wave of confusion, celebration, and denial that we are going to walk through carefully, because the full picture is far more interesting than a single headline. Here's where the story gets genuinely tense. Only hours after the president's claim went public, Iran's own foreign ministry pushed back hard. A spokesperson called the ceasefire claim false and baseless. Think about what that means for a moment. One side is telling the world, we won, they begged us to stop. The other side is telling its own people, that never happened. We did not ask for anything. Both statements cannot be fully true at the same time, and that contradiction is exactly the kind of moment that reveals what was actually happening behind closed doors. Within 2 days of that denial, everything changed again. A 2-week ceasefire was formally announced. Iran agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water that a huge share of the world's oil passes through every single day. In exchange, the bombing paused. Whatever was said privately between the two governments, something real had shifted enough to bring 38 days of continuous combat to a stop, even if only temporarily. So now the real question becomes obvious. What actually pushed Iran to accept a pause after weeks of refusing to bend? To answer that, we need to look past the public statements and into what was physically happening in the skies above Iran in the days right before that ceasefire was reached. It is worth remembering, too, that this was not the first time Iran had been accused of saying one thing publicly and something very different privately during this exact conflict. Throughout the campaign, Iranian officials had repeatedly promised devastating retaliation against American assets in the region, while at the same time, according to officials briefed on the situation, sending signals through intermediaries suggesting a willingness to talk. That pattern of loud public defiance paired with quiet private outreach did not appear out of nowhere in early April. It had been building for weeks, and the ceasefire announcement was simply the moment it finally became visible to the outside world. Let's talk about the Pentagon's own account, because unlike the online back and forth, this part comes directly from officials speaking on the record. A day after the ceasefire was announced, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood at a podium and did not hold back. Iran begged for the ceasefire, and we all know it, he told reporters. He went further, saying the operation had decimated Iran's military and left it combat ineffective for years to come. That is not vague language. That is a sitting cabinet official putting his own credibility behind a very specific claim made publicly in front of cameras with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs standing right beside him. General Dan Kane, the top military officer in the country, added numbers to back up that language. He said the campaign had struck more than 13,000 targets. He said roughly 80% of Iran's air defense systems had been destroyed. He described Iran's naval fleet as reduced by 90% and said the country's ballistic missile production had been functionally destroyed. Whether or not you take every number at face value, the scale being described here is enormous, a level of sustained damage that goes far beyond a handful of symbolic strikes. Before we move to the part almost nobody explained properly, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're about to get into the piece of this story that actually explains why Iran's calculation changed when it did, not just what officials claimed afterward. Let's talk about the B-52. This bomber first flew in the 1950s. It is older than almost every pilot flying it today, older than most of the buildings in the Pentagon complex where Hegseth made his announcement. On paper, that sounds like an outdated weapon in a war filled with stealth jets and precision missiles. In practice, it turned out to be one of the most important tools in the entire operation, and understanding why tells you everything about how this war was actually won on the ground. Early in the conflict, the B-52 was used carefully, launching missiles from a safe distance while Iran's air defenses were still active and dangerous. Getting close would have been reckless. A plane this size without the stealth features of something like the B-2 would have been an easy target if Iranian radar and missile systems were still functioning at full strength. So for the opening weeks, the B-52 stayed back, supporting the fight without flying directly over the country it was hitting. Then, in late March, something changed. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs confirmed that B-52s had begun flying directly over Iranian territory for the first time. Given the increase in air superiority, he said, the military had started conducting overland B-52 missions, allowing them to keep pressure on the enemy in a way that simply was not possible before. Read that sentence carefully, because it is the key to this entire story. The only reason a slow, non-stealth bomber could suddenly fly straight over hostile territory is if the danger below it had already been mostly cleared away. That is the real significance of the B-52 moment. It was not really about the plane itself. It was proof, delivered in the sky for everyone to see, that Iran's ability to defend its own airspace had been broken. Radar systems that once could have tracked and targeted an aircraft like this were no longer functioning well enough to stop it. From that point forward, these bombers began dropping precision-guided bombs and massive bunker-busting munitions directly onto missile factories and underground facilities, targets that had previously required far more expensive and limited stealth aircraft to reach. Within days of that shift, reports describe some of the heaviest strikes of the entire campaign, hitting missile command posts, launch coordination centers, and hardened storage sites buried underground. This is the part that matters most for understanding Iran's decision to eventually pause. A country facing occasional missile strikes can absorb the damage and keep functioning. A country watching an Inai, old, slow, unstealthy bomber fly openly over its own capital region, dropping bomb after bomb with almost nothing left to stop it, is watching a much darker signal. It is watching confirmation that the fight is already lost in the sky, and that whatever comes next will only get worse. Let's pause here and really think about why this specific detail carries so much weight. A modern stealth jet flying a single high-value mission signals something focused and limited. A slow-moving bomber flying repeated missions over open territory signals something much bigger, an enemy that no longer feels the need to hide because there is nothing left capable of shooting back. That distinction is not just military trivia, it is psychological. It tells a government under pressure that this is not a temporary storm to wait out. It is a demonstration that the sky itself now belongs to someone else. There is also a cost side to this story worth understanding, because it explains why the B-52 specifically mattered so much once air superiority was achieved. Stealth bombers are expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and limited in number, which means they get reserved for the most sensitive, highest value targets. The B-52 is the opposite. It is cheaper to fly, carries a far bigger payload, and was built from the start for exactly this kind of sustained, repeated bombing over a long campaign. Once the skies were cleared, switching to this workhorse aircraft was not just possible, it was the most efficient way to keep the pressure constant, night after night, without slowing down. Now let's connect this back to the numbers we mentioned earlier, because none of this happened in isolation. By the time those overland B-52 missions started, officials were already describing thousands of targets struck and most of the country's air defense network destroyed. The B-52 flying overhead was not the beginning of the pressure campaign. It was the visible proof that the earlier phases had already worked. Every previous week of strikes had been quietly clearing the path for this exact moment, and when it finally arrived, it landed on a government that had already been worn down for over a month straight. This is where the story becomes genuinely important beyond just this one conflict. Wars are rarely decided by a single dramatic strike that everyone instantly recognizes as historic. They are decided by accumulation, one target destroyed after another, one defense system knocked out after another, until a specific moment arrives where continuing the fight no longer makes sense to the side absorbing all the damage. The B-52 flying over Iran was that moment made visible. It was not the cause of Iran's weakness. It was the confirmation of it. This pattern is not new, and looking at history helps explain why it repeats so often. Across decades of modern air power, there are similar examples of a government holding firm through sustained bombing, right up until a specific escalation crossed a line that made the cost of continuing simply too high to justify, even while public statements kept insisting nothing had changed. What usually breaks first is not the willingness to fight in public. It is the private, quiet realization among decision makers that there is no longer a realistic path to a better outcome by continuing. Before we go further, drop a comment telling us what part of this story surprised you the most, the ceasefire denial, the B-52 detail, or the numbers from the Pentagon briefing. I read every single comment, and it genuinely shapes what we cover next on this channel. Let's talk about the contradiction sitting right at the center of this entire story, because it is the piece that explains almost everything else. In public, Iran has continued acting defiant. Officials deny that any request for a ceasefire ever happened. State media has continued describing the outcome in terms of resistance and strength rather than retreat. And yet, behind that public posture, the country agreed to open the Strait of Hormuz, accepted a pause in fighting, and stepped back from a conflict its own officials had spent weeks insisting it would never step back from. How can both of those things be true at once? The answer is simpler than it looks. Governments under intense pressure almost always manage two audiences at the same time, their own population and their adversary abroad. What gets said to calm and reassure people at home is often very different from what gets communicated quietly through diplomatic channels when the reality on the ground has become impossible to ignore. A leadership admitting weakness in public risks losing control of its own narrative and possibly its own grip on power. A leadership quietly seeking relief through private channels while maintaining strength in public is one of the oldest patterns in the history of warfare. This is not unique to Iran, and it is worth understanding as a pattern rather than a single strange event. Throughout history, nations facing overwhelming and sustained pressure have often continued projecting confidence publicly right up until the moment a deal is quietly reached behind the scenes. The gap between the public story and the private reality is usually where the actual truth of a conflict lives, and this situation fits that pattern almost perfectly. There is a domestic angle worth understanding on the American side too, because a campaign of this length and intensity never comes free at home either. Sustained bombing campaigns burn through munitions and interceptor stockpiles fast, and 38 straight days of combat operations put real strain on those resources. That kind of pressure tends to shape how long any administration is willing to keep escalating before looking for an off-ramp of its own, even while publicly describing the campaign as an overwhelming success. Both sides, in other words, likely had reasons of their own for wanting a pause at roughly the same moment, even if those reasons were completely different from each other. Now let's look at why the timing of all this matters just as much as the events themselves. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a random detail in this story. It is one of the most important waterways on Earth, carrying a massive share of the world's daily oil shipments. Even the threat of it closing sends oil prices moving and rattles markets far beyond the region. When Trump publicly tied the ceasefire directly to reopening that strait, he was not just talking about ending a war. He was talking about protecting the flow of energy that much of the global economy depends on every single day. That is part of why this moment carried weight well outside of Iran and the United States. Energy markets, shipping companies, and governments around the world were all watching this exact sequence of events unfold in real time, because the outcome had consequences reaching far beyond the two countries directly involved. Think about how many industries were quietly holding their breath through this entire 5-week stretch. Airlines rerouting flights away from the region. Shipping companies recalculating insurance costs on tankers passing anywhere near the Gulf. Oil traders adjusting positions based on nothing more than a single social media post from the White House. A regional war between two countries turned, almost overnight, into a global economic story simply because of where it happened to be fought. There's also a wider regional angle worth understanding here, because Iran was never fighting in complete isolation, and neither was the United States. Gulf countries hosting American bases spent this entire campaign in an uncomfortable position, wanting the fighting to end quickly, while also quietly relying on American protection to keep their own airspace secure. Some of those same countries, according to officials involved in the later diplomacy, played a role in encouraging both sides toward a pause once it became clear the fighting was not going to shift decisively in Iran's favor. Regional pressure like that rarely makes headlines the way a bomber or a ceasefire announcement does, but it often shapes the timing of these moments just as much as anything happening on the battlefield itself. It is also worth talking honestly about how differently this story got covered depending on where you were watching from. Some coverage leaned hard into celebratory language, treating the ceasefire almost like a scene from an action movie, a powerful nation forcing a defiant regime to its knees through sheer overwhelming force. Other coverage treated the same set of facts with far more caution, separating confirmed statements from officials out of what was speculation, assumption, or wishful thinking dressed up as reporting. That gap matters, because a story this significant does not need exaggeration to be compelling. The confirmed facts alone, a 5-week bombing campaign, thousands of targets struck, a ceasefire announced and immediately disputed, and an old bomber flying openly over enemy soil are already remarkable enough without adding anything extra on top of them. Let's also talk honestly about what a 2-week ceasefire actually means, because it is important not to mistake a pause for a permanent resolution. 2 weeks is not peace. It is a window. Inside that window, wider negotiations are supposed to continue, addressing the deeper issues that started this conflict in the first place, particularly concerns over Iran's nuclear program. But a pause built on pressure rather than genuine mutual agreement often carries real fragility inside it. It buys time. It does not automatically resolve the underlying tension that caused the fighting to begin with. That is exactly why officials on the American side were careful with their language even while celebrating. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs made a point of saying that a ceasefire is a pause and that forces remained ready to resume the exact same level of combat operations if needed. That single sentence tells you something important. Even the side describing this as a total victory understands that the underlying conflict has not disappeared. It has simply gone quiet for now. If this kind of detailed breakdown is exactly what you come to this channel for, this is the perfect moment to hit subscribe. Because the next 2 weeks are going to decide whether this pause turns into something lasting or simply resets the clock before round 2. So where does that leave things going forward? Iran gets time to regroup, rebuild what it can, and manage the political fallout of a war its own government still refuses to publicly describe as a defeat. The United States gets to point to a long list of destroyed targets, a reopened shipping lane, and a public claim of victory it can use to justify the cost of the campaign. Both sides walk away from this moment with a story they can tell their own people, even though those two stories barely resemble each other. It is worth sitting with just how differently the same set of events is going to be remembered depending on which side is telling the story. In Washington, this becomes a case study in what sustained, overwhelming pressure can accomplish when it is applied consistently over weeks, rather than delivered in a single dramatic strike. In Tehran, it becomes a story about resilience, about surviving 38 days of bombardment and still walking away with the regime intact, and a narrative of endurance rather than surrender. Neither government has much incentive to tell the version that makes the other side look right, which is exactly why so much of what actually happened only comes into focus when you line up the statements from both sides against each other rather than trusting either one alone. Let's also talk about what officials described happening to Iran's nuclear-related capacity during this campaign, because it sits at the very center of why this war started in the first place. Concerns over Iran's nuclear program were the original justification for launching Operation Epic Fury, and officials have pointed to strikes on enrichment-related infrastructure as one of the campaign's central achievements. Whether that damage is permanent or simply a serious delay is a question that will likely take much longer to fully answer than a single press briefing can settle. Rebuilding destroyed industrial infrastructure, especially anything tied to a program that took decades to develop in the first place, is not something any country manages in a matter of months. That single fact alone explains why officials on the American side describe Iran as combat ineffective for years to come rather than simply defeated. Years is a very specific word choice, and it tells you how long this particular kind of damage is expected to last. Quick pause here. If you want more breakdowns like this the moment new developments happen, tap that subscribe button now and turn on notifications. Because stories like this one rarely stay quiet for long, and we will be covering whatever comes out of the next round of talks in real time. Zoom out for a moment and think about what this entire episode teaches us about how modern power actually gets applied and measured. It is tempting to think of military strength purely in terms of technology. Who has the newest jet, the fastest missile, the most advanced radar? This conflict tells a different story. The single most consequential aircraft in the final stretch of this war was not the newest thing in the sky. It was the oldest. What actually mattered was not innovation, it was persistence. The simple, repeated ability to keep showing up night after night until the other side had nothing left to answer with. That lesson applies far beyond just this one conflict. Sustained pressure, applied consistently over weeks rather than delivered all at once, tends to produce exactly the kind of psychological breaking point we saw here. A single overwhelming strike can shock a country. A month of accumulating losses, with no clear endpoint in sight, tends to change how that country's leadership actually thinks about its own options. That distinction between shock and exhaustion is worth remembering the next time a conflict like this one appears in the headlines, because it usually explains far more about how these situations actually end than any single dramatic moment does on its own. Here is the deeper lesson worth carrying away from everything we just walked through. Modern conflicts rarely end with a clean, obvious moment that everyone agrees on. They end, or at least pause, through a mix of accumulated pressure, a specific visible turning point that changes the psychology of the side absorbing the damage, and quiet, private communication that only becomes clear well after the fact. In this case, that turning point was not a single missile or a single speech. It was an old bomber flying openly over territory that, weeks earlier, would have been far too dangerous to enter. That image alone told Iran's leadership everything they needed to know about how the rest of this conflict was likely to go if they kept refusing to talk. Let's think for a moment about what happens if this pause fails to hold. Reports already describe both sides continuing smaller-scale friction even while the broader ceasefire remains in place, a reminder that lower-level tension rarely disappears just because the headline fighting is stopped. If talks over the next 2 weeks break down, the same forces that were used to force this pause remain fully available and, according to officials, ready to resume immediately. That is not a comforting thought, but it is an honest one, and understanding it is far more useful than simply accepting whichever headline sounds the most dramatic. There is also something worth remembering about how quickly public narratives can spiral once a story like this starts circulating. Within days of the ceasefire, multiple versions of these events spread across different channels, each adding its own dramatic flourishes, invented dialogue, and speculative detail that go well beyond anything officials actually confirmed. That is exactly why this breakdown has stuck closely to statements made on the record, from the president's own public posts to Hegseth's press conference to Kane's numbers at the podium, rather than repeating unverified claims simply because they sound compelling. It also helps to think about how this moment will likely be remembered years from now, once the immediate noise has faded. Officials who describe this as a total victory have every reason to keep telling that version, because it justifies the enormous cost and risk of the campaign. Officials on the Iranian side have just as much reason to insist nothing was ever begged for, because admitting otherwise carries real consequences for how their own government is viewed at home. Neither version is likely to disappear completely. Both will probably keep circulating for years, shaping how each side prepares for the next confrontation, whenever and wherever that ends up happening. One more thing worth noticing before we wrap this up. Notice how much of this entire story depended on a single old aircraft rather than anything cutting edge or futuristic. There's a real lesson in that for anyone trying to understand how modern power actually works. It is rarely about having the newest technology available. It is about having the ability to apply pressure consistently for as long as it takes without running out of options. The 70-year-old bomber design did not win this because it was advanced. It won because everything ahead of it had already cleared the way and because it could keep coming back, night after night, for as long as necessary. So here is where we land. A war that started in late February ended, at least for now, not because both sides suddenly found peace in their hearts, but because one side ran out of room to keep absorbing damage while continuing to pretend nothing had changed. An old bomber flying over enemy skies became the clearest signal of that shift, more honest in some ways than any press conference or social media post that followed. Whether this pause becomes a real turning point toward lasting peace, or simply a pause before the next chapter begins, depends entirely on what happens in the negotiating room over the next 2 weeks, far away from the cameras and the headlines, and that is really the heart of this whole story. Power in modern conflict is rarely about who shouts the loudest. It is about who can keep applying pressure long after the other side has run out of ways to respond. Iran spent weeks insisting it would never bend. The skies above its own cities eventually told a very different story, one that no press release could fully erase. Whatever happens next, whether these 2 weeks turn into a lasting peace or simply a brief intermission before the fighting resumes, one thing about this moment is already clear. The version told in Washington and the version told in Tehran will likely never fully agree with each other. But somewhere between a president's social media post, a defense secretary's press conference, and an old bomber flying quietly over enemy territory, the real story of how this pause actually happened is sitting in plain sight for anyone willing to look past the headlines and put the pieces together. If you made it this far, you clearly care about understanding what is actually happening in the world, not just the loudest version of it. Tell us in the comments whether you think this ceasefire holds, or whether this is simply the quiet before the next storm. Like this video if it gave you a clearer picture than anything else you have watched on this topic. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next update drops, and share it with someone who has been trying to make sense of this conflict from all the noise online. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we will see you in the next one.